Boop. Happy Monday. It is Monday, May 18th, 2020. We are officially on the short side of the month of May. And our daily Bible readings for today come from Psalm 93, Genesis 9, 8 through 17, and then Acts 27, 39 through 44. But I'm going to stick with Acts today because it follows up on the story we were already into on Friday, in which our hero Paul the Apostle is on his way to Rome on a ship, and they get caught at sea. And when we left them last week, they were being pushed out to sea. And the last thing that happens in the section that we had Friday is that they start to take soundings. And I don't know if you understand what that means or not, but basically they would have a rope with a weight on the end of it, and it would be marked in some way, usually like knots that were kind of regular distances apart, and they could drop it in the water till the weight hit the bottom and count the number of knots or whatever, and they would know how many feet of water they were in. I think the text says fathoms. And so last week's text, or last Friday's text, the sailors started doing that because they felt like they were getting in closer to shore, and they wanted to be sure of that because they didn't want to run aground or hit rocks or reefs or things like that in the midst of this horrible storm they were caught up in. And so they started taking depth soundings so they'd know how many feet of water they were in, and they realized that they were getting into shallower and shallower water, so they thought they were near shore. So all of a sudden they thought, well, we better stop where we are. And they were also in shallow enough water they could drop anchors, so they dropped 4 anchors into the water, and so that they would not move anymore in the dark and know where they were. And then where we pick up today, the sun has come up, and they're floundering in the surf, and they see off in the distance a harbor. They can tell they're close to shore, and they see a harbor with a beach that they think they can land on. So they had these 4 anchors holding them in place because they were afraid. They had this fear of running aground in the dark and dying. So anyway, like I said, though, the morning light comes up, and they can see through the midst of the storm. Hasn't gone away. It's still pretty bad. Lots of wind, lots of waves. But they can glimpse off in the distance this better place that they can get to. I guess you could look at it as they can glimpse a better future. In the morning light, they see the far shore. And so they decide to chance it. They decide to take a risk and move to this better place that's better than the place they are, and gives them better chances and better opportunities. And so they decide to chance it. And this thing is, though, it's the anchors that were kind of keeping them in place. They had these things that were tying them down literally to the ocean floor that kept them from drifting into more dangerous situations. But in order to get to the place that they wanted to be, the place that was better for them to be, they had to cut those anchors away. In the ancient world, anchors were kind of disposable. It's not like, you see ships today and they have these big, huge steel anchors that, are major investments, and they you pull them up when you get ready to go. You don't just like cut them loose and leave them. In the ancient world, they were just big rocks that you tied a rope through and dropped it overboard, and when you wanted to go, you just cut it away. And so they had to cut the anchors away from them in order to leave the place they were and move on to a better place. That's a moment of decision right then. If you really want to move to a place that you think you should be, away from the place that you are, a place that you think is better, that really takes a lot of faith in the place you're going and the way you're going to get there, to cut those anchors away. You have to make a decision. Are you going to stay put, or are you going to move? And that may mean for ourselves, when we see places or realize that the place we can't stay there anymore, and that in order to get to some place better, that we may have to cut away the anchors that hold us down. And that may mean cutting yourself loose from all the anchors in your life. If you see a place that you think you want to get to, or a place that you realize God is calling you to, that means you may have to cut away a lot of the anchors that you've set that are holding you in place. And that could be people or places or things. And that doesn't mean that the place you're going to is necessarily safer. but or that the anchors that you have are any safer, but they sure are secure, and they make you feel secure. And sometimes we get so tied to our anchors that we, I guess, don't really enjoy the safety of the places we're moving to. So, but like I said, they're secure, or at least they feel that way. And sometimes I think it's our anchors that hold us back because we just like the way they feel. It's what we know. It's not anything, we don't want to risk the newness of the place we're heading to. It's interesting, John Wesley in his journal, his journals start off with his journey to the New World to do this great thing that he thought he was being called to, and then you have him journeying there on a ship, and he gets caught up in storms at sea, and then on the way home he gets caught up on storms at sea. And on the way there, he's kind of like the people on the ship with Paul. He's very fearful about dying, but he comes across these people called the Moravians who they haven't set their anchor so much on the ship that they're in or their own abilities. John Wesley's very much caught up in trusting in his own abilities. But their anchor is set on God, and that's the thing that they're anchored to. So, to the point that even in the midst of the storm, that they are singing psalms and they're praising God. The way John Wesley talks about it, they don't actually let the storm that's swamping the ship and tossing it to and from stop them from going about the things that they usually do. They keep focusing on God, even though everything around them is going to pot. They keep their anchor set firmly on God, and that's what lets them go where they need to go to and get done what they need to get done. And John Wesley asked these Moravians, he's like, aren't you afraid in the midst of the storm? Aren't you afraid of dying? And the Moravians say, no, we're not. We're thankful to have God with us. We're taking praise in God, and that's what we do. It's this constant struggle with fear was a big problem for Wesley. He early on, and I don't know that he ever completely got rid of it. I think he kind of mastered it, realized that he had a lot more going on if he focused on doing God's work and God's will. But it was a big problem for him. Even when he has kind of failed in his mission and he's on his way back to England after only about 18 months, I think it says, after having left England in the first place. Let's just say 2 years. Let's round it up. He's on his way back to England, and he's not that far off from arriving home in England when he gets hit by another storm, and he goes through this all over again. But he realizes that there's something missing, that he had trusted a lot in his own ability and his own skills and his own anchors, I guess, that he had set his hopes on and he trusted in, and that's what he thought was going to save him. And he's getting back to England. He's almost back to England, and we have this famous quote from Wesley, and he says, "I went to America to convert the Indians, but oh, who shall convert me? Who is he that will deliver me from this evil heart of unbelief?" He says, "I have a fair summer religion. I can talk well, nay, and believe myself, while no danger is near. But let death look me in the face, and my spirit is troubled. Nor can I say, to die is to gain." And then he throws in this quote. He doesn't attribute it, but he says, "I have a sin of fear that when I've spun my last thread, I shall perish on the shore." That's the heart of what keeps us from cutting the anchors away that hold us back and keep us from getting to that far shore. The quote that he has there is from a guy named John Donne, who I've talked about recently. And it's a poem of his called A Hymn to God the Father. And the whole poem goes like this. "Wilt thou forgive that shame where I begun, which was my sin, though it were done before? Wilt thou forgive that sin through which I run, and do still run, though still I do deplore? When thou hast done, thou hast not done, for I have more. Wilt thou forgive that sin which I have won others to sin, and made my sin their door? Wilt thou forgive that sin which I did shun a year or two, but wallowed in a score? When thou hast done, thou hast not done, for I have more. I have a sin of fear that when I have spun my last thread, I shall perish on the shore. Wesley's fear was that he had done all this and he might die on the ship and find out that the gospel wasn't true. And he realized that he'd been going to preach to all these people and was preaching under his own power and his own authority and didn't really even necessarily have faith in Christ or the very gospel that he was preaching. We have this fear that keeps us from cutting loose the anchors and heading to the shore, but we're also afraid that maybe the things that we've put our trust in are maybe worthwhile than the one who's calling us to that far shore. You know, it's really easy for me to sit here and tell you that in the midst of everything that's going on, maybe you're safer just cutting anchor and heading towards the shore. The reality is, what might be better for you in the long run doesn't necessarily mean it's safer in the short term. If you look at the rest of this section from Acts 27:39 through 44, it doesn't get safer right away for them. They run aground. They end up running the ship aground, and they end up losing the ship. But that's the short term. In the long term, they save the people. And if you remember from Friday, Paul had told everyone that God had given him word that he was to be trusted, that he would save them in the midst of the storm, that everyone in the midst of the storm would be saved. I think the text last week said there was 270 odd some odd people on that ship. It's hard to cut our anchors in the midst of a storm. It's hard to go away from those things we've put our trust in. But you got to ask yourself at the end of the day, are you really trusting in the right thing? Is the reason that you won't go to the far shores because you're afraid that once you get there, you'll still perish anyway? But John Donne wouldn't have written that hymn to God the Father if he didn't think that God would forgive that sin in which he'd run and led others to sin. And John Wesley, at the end of the day, realized that it was Christ who had saved him and that he did have faith in him. So, it's been a longer lesson today than usual, but we'll be back tomorrow for Tuesday's Daily Bible Reading. So have a good day. I'll see you tomorrow.